I lived in St. Paul for like 6 months. We had this place that actually, we rehearsed in the upstairs of it. This is in the dig. And we were busted by the state pollution control agency for noise pollution. Because one of the neighbors was so mad at us, and we were terribly, horribly loud, like really, really, really loud, that they actually got somebody from the pollution control agency to stand outside with a decibel meter and write up a report. So we were actually shut down by the state. Who's that happened to? You know? That was a good story. So yeah, I moved out of that place, moved back to my parents for a little bit, and then I began my long residency in Dinkytown about a year after that.
Well, and you started working at that record store too, right? I mean,
well, yeah, I started working, I was out of the record store game for a while. I didn't start back in it. I was working at First Avenue. Like when I was about 20, I was interested in doing live sound, and I was starting to record bands already. Because parallel to all this band stuff, I was like doing recordings on the 8-track, or on the 4-track, and then on 8-track. And I had started to do sound for people. And I mean, I should probably preface like talking about recording. The reason that I got into it was like, you know, initially as a notepad with the Porta Studio, but it's hard to explain to people how weird the studio environment in Minneapolis was back then, or anywhere really, but particularly Minneapolis, because now there's like all these recording schools, and there's like dozens of people who are qualified to do stuff, and there's all kinds of cool kids that are into cool music, like they're into indie rock or they're into hip hop or whatever. Now, back then, it was all dudes who were like these sort of muso, like kind of jazz head dudes and rich dudes, because studios were fantastically expensive, you know? It's like buying the gear was crazy. Like a tape machine cost like 50 grand, you know? So the only dudes that are going to do that are rich kids or like weird sort of, you know, it was not a punk rock friendly environment, you know. And if you did try to go to most of these legitimate studios back then and try to sound the way that you wanted to sound, they just thought you were insane. Like I had a couple of experiences going into proper studios, and it would just be like, you hear those stories about like the Beatles would go in, they say, oh, you must turn your amp down or something, you know. It was just like that, where you have some kind of metalhead, like, you know, like Steely Dan fan dude, and you're going, you know, like sort of, and they're just like, they think you're crazy. And so I was like, I have to learn how to do this myself, because I've got ideas and my friends have ideas, and we have to figure out a way to channel this stuff, because otherwise there's no resource for it. And later on we found out that there were some cool people, but even like, you know, Blackberry Way and those kind of studios, like where the Replacements recorded and a bunch of other bands, that stuff was like pretty expensive back in the day. Like studios in the 80s were like $500, $600, $700 a day for these studios, like Cookhouse or whatever, which is like as much or more as they are now. You know, it was like crazy. And people would go and do records, like they would save and save and save and save and do like their entire record top to bottom like in a day, you know. And then, and at the end of it, like I remember going to sessions at Cookhouse or Nicollet or whatever it was called there. Like I remember specifically, well, the first Blew Up record, this band that I worked with, that Grant Hart was producing. And I remember, and it was one of my earliest like studio experiences. And I remember going in there, and they would like gate the drums to tape because it was faster, you know. So assuming that, you know, and noise gating is like this thing where basically you set up the microphone so it shuts off unless the sound is actually supposed to be happening, you know. But they would do it to tape, so it was a destructive process. Like that's the way it's going to be. And so we had this thing where the drummer from the band was like playing fills, and it'd be like, like, you know, sort of holes in the middle of the fills because they had set the gates wrong, you know. And they would set it up and run the entire mix with the entire record the same, just like run it at the end of the day in an hour or something. Like no attention to detail of any of the songs or trying to make stuff sound cool or make the song sound unique. I was just like, this is like, I understand why people are doing this because they don't have like budgets, but there's got to be a better way. And I knew there was a better way because somehow I'd gotten that damn 4-track. And I knew that I was getting results that were not professional, but they were aesthetically better than the stuff that was coming out of real studios, in my opinion. And so that was, you know, that was a major sort of motivation. So I started recording bands. We started talking about this because I already knew my way around a board and stuff, so I went to work at First Avenue and became a house soundman at First Avenue and did 4 years of that, which is another one of those things I can't even express how important that was.
In both the entry of the main room? Or was
yeah, mostly the entry, because I wanted, when Bill Batson, who is the singer of the Hipsters, Mofos, like a legendary figure around here, was also an entry sound man, and he worked as a monitor mixer for Husker Du. And so Husker Du, in their big last push in sort of 1986, 87 stuff, were on the road like, you know, forever. They were out like, you know, sort of 11 months a year or something like that, and Bill was along on most of that. So I wound up covering most of the shifts that he had in the entry. So I did, and again, that was like so lucky, I can't even imagine it now, because I did like every new band night with the exception of like 2 between like sometime late in 1986 and sometime the beginning of 1989 or something like that. So I saw everybody, you know, it was like first trip Shakespeare show, you know, sort of, you know, just like, you know, tons, all these bands who had never like sort of done stuff before did all their first shows and got to know everybody, because they were all the kids that were like me, who were coming in from the suburbs or coming out of their basement from wherever and playing their first shows. And it's just like crazy numbers of people that I met that way. And I got really lucky. I mean, it's like, when do you get that experience? And that place is like, you know, it still is an amazing place, First Avenue, but the diversity of stuff that used to happen back in the day when Steve McClellan was the booking agent was jaw-dropping, because you would walk in and there would be a bill with some funk band with like 10 lines of DIs with synth drums or something like that. You'd have to deal with that. And then there'd be like some metal band, and then there'd be like some very early hip-hop thing with just a couple of inputs, you know. And then there'd be G.G. Allen, you know, you know, or Dinosaur Jr. or something that's just like just mind-warping, you know, Swans in the entry, you know. It's just like crazy, you know. And I worked on these shows. It was like really, really weird. And also getting the opportunity to start to meet touring people, more touring people, who I wound up being lifelong friends with in certain cases, you know. Like that started when everybody was 20 and it's like, hey dude, where are you from? I'm from Boston. Oh cool, want to smoke some pot? You know, and then everybody becomes friends, you know. It's like weird. It's like you couldn't pay for an education like that. You could go to 20 years of IPR and you're never going to get anything remotely like that. I mean, for good or for ill. But it was definitely an interesting way to start things.